There. My name is Tim Stratton. I'm with Freethinking Ministries, and I want to welcome everybody here in the room, and I want to welcome everybody watching live on Facebook and anybody else that might be watching this video later. Oh, and by the way, I want to send a special shout out to my friend Ryan Denhart, who I know is watching right now. You better be. All right. So anyway, we're going to be discussing the ontological argument today. We talked about it last week. And we're going to finish the conversation today, hopefully, anyway. And the ontological argument basically shows that if a maximally great being, or if God exists in a possible world, or a possible reality, then it turns out that the maximally great being exists in our world, in our reality. This is because God is a necessary being. Now, when I refer to God, just know that I mean a maximally great being, especially in the context of the ontological argument. When I use the word God, I mean maximally great being. And when I say maximally great being, well, that's what I call God. So I use those terms interchangeably. So God is a necessary being, or a maximally great being would be a necessary being. So people might say, well, I don't believe in God, but I suppose he could exist. But you see, if they say that, then the ontological argument shows that God does exist. So to show God does not exist, you'll have to show that God does not exist in any possible world or any reality. This means you'll have to show that God is impossible. Like a married bachelor. Married bachelors do not exist in any possible world. You'll have to show that the idea of God is nonsensical, like a square circle, or that 2 plus 2 equals 5, or that a triangle has 4 corners. I mean, there's no triangle with 4 corners anywhere. Those things are impossible to exist. And there's no possible world in which a triangle has 4 corners. But the idea of God is different. The idea of God doesn't seem to be nonsensical like those examples, married bachelors. Even many non-believers agree that the idea of God is possible. The idea of a maximally great being is possible. Richard Dawkins would admit that much. Even Lawrence Krauss and Neil deGrasse Tyson. They would admit that the idea of God, it's at least possible. Now, here's a question. Can't God at least exist in one possible reality? What's so nonsensical about someone being all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, and necessary, who exists in another world or another reality? Now, I just referenced what I call the big three. That God is all-powerful, that means God is omnipotent. That God is all-knowing, that means he's omniscient. And that God is all-loving, that means omnibenevolent. I call those the big three. I spend a lot of time discussing God's omni-properties. And in fact, I argue for certain theological positions. I argue with other Christians about this. And I'm constantly referring to God's omni-attributes, the things that make God a maximally great being. The things that would make a maximally great being perfect. So that's God's omnipotence, his omniscience, and his omnibenevolence. Now, also, I'm talking about a necessary being. If you remember the Leibnizian cosmological argument, you'll remember that some things exist contingently and other things would exist by a necessity of their own nature. That is to say, some things are necessarily true in any possible world. 2 plus 2 will always equal 4. In any possible world, the law of the excluded middle will still apply. So anyway, that argument that I mentioned is called the Omni Argument. I've written about it a whole bunch on my website. I encourage you to look around there for more on God's omni attributes. But here's the thing, talking about necessity and existing by necessity of its own nature, if something is necessarily true. If you already believe that some things are necessary, for example, that 2 plus 2 equals 4 necessarily, then why can't other things be necessary too? Like God. Can't there be a possible reality where there's maybe really powerful aliens who can blow up planets? I mean, have you seen Star Wars? Darth Vader is really powerful. He's got the Force, right? In that sense, he'd be a more powerful being than I am. I can imagine that. He's got the Death Star, and he can blow up planets. Very powerful. Well, oh, and by the way, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen the new Thor movie, stop listening, turn it off, okay, run. Okay, but let me tell you, in the new Thor movie, Asgard gets destroyed by a very powerful being. We can imagine this. All right, now, therefore there's a possible world. I don't think that Asgard actually exists in reality. But there's a possible world in which Asgard and Thor do exist. And this other really powerful being who destroys Asgard. Okay, if you're watching, I'm done talking about Thor, so come on back. Okay. Anyway, if we can imagine very powerful beings that exist in other possible worlds, why can't we also believe that there could be someone who is all powerful in another reality? And by all powerful, I just mean someone who could do all things that are logically possible. All things that are logically possible. I mean, that's easy to imagine, because as soon as you start saying, well, I can't do something that's impossible, well, then that wouldn't even be a possible world to imagine in the first place, because it would be logically incoherent. So, if you can imagine a very powerful being, beings that are much more powerful than we are, why can't you just go all the way and imagine an omni-powerful being or an omnipotent being? So, if you can't show why the idea of God or a maximally great being is impossible, then we have no reason to think that God is impossible. Thus, it's rational to believe a maximally great being, or God, is possible. That is to say, God exists in a possible world. Even if right now you don't think he exists in the actual world, you can at least conceive of, you can imagine that God exists in a possible world. That is to say, the idea of God is coherent. It makes sense. Even if you don't think it's true, the idea still makes sense. So God exists in a possible world. Well, are there other reasons to think that God could exist, besides the fact that the idea of God is just coherent? Well, yes, there's many other arguments, reasons to think that God exists. Remember the Leibnizian cosmological argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, the moral argument, the free-thinking argument, the fine-tuning argument, the historical argument for the resurrection points to the existence of God. In fact, Alvin Plantinga has noted there's a couple dozen arguments or so concluding that God exists. There's lots of reasons to think God exists, and at the very least, there's lots of reasons to at least think it's possible, even if you're not persuaded by any of these arguments. They at least do enough to put the idea of God on the table to consider, yeah, I don't believe in God, but yeah, it sure is possible that he exists. So if you tell people these other arguments, they might still not believe these arguments, or might not come to the conclusion that God exists. But most people will admit that the arguments at least show God could exist. And if they admit that, well then you share the ontological argument, the modal ontological argument, after you share the other arguments. I encourage you to go to the website, freethinkingministries.com. I have an article on there where I started with the Kalam. It's probably better to start with the Leibnizian, but I like to start with the Kalam just so I could have the title that I had. It was called the Ontological Argument. That's so much fun to say. The ontological argument. Let's all say it together. The ontological argument. Good. Good job, everybody out there in the Facebook world. All right. So I encourage you to go there and check out that article. I start with the kalam and then show the possibility of the existence of God to then argue that God exists through the ontological argument. Now, this raises a question. Tim, is the ontological argument too easy? Is it too easy? I mean, some people think we should not use this argument, even other Christians. Some Christian apologists don't like this argument because they say it can be used to prove that all sorts of weird things exist. Well, let's see if this is true. Let's look at this first example. So in another world, in another possible world, there exists a very special unicorn. Okay, let's all imagine a unicorn. We can do that. So a possible world exists in which a unicorn exists. But now not just any unicorn, a pink unicorn. Get that? Okay, do you got it? I've got it. Okay. A possible world exists in which a pink unicorn exists. But let's call this pink unicorn, let's give it a name, Pinky. Okay. Pinky the pink unicorn. Now, Pinky is special. Not just any pink unicorn. Oh, no. Pinky is a necessary unicorn. Pinky the necessary unicorn. Well, if Pinky is a necessary unicorn, then the ontological argument can be applied to Pinky to show that Pinky exists in our reality, in our world, somewhere. So somewhere in our reality and somewhere in this world, in the actual world, there exists a necessary pink unicorn. But this seems ridiculous, right? This is absurd. And in fact, this is one way to discredit arguments. Even if you can't find out what's exactly wrong in some arguments, if you can use the same exact argument with other things and you can reach absurd conclusions, then even if you can't find out what's exactly wrong with the argument you don't like, you can say, hey, look, this argument applied to X over here shows an absurd conclusion, therefore I do not have to accept the logical conclusions over here. So the argument, when applied to Pinky the necessary unicorn, seems absurd, and so can we just dismiss the ontological argument for God's existence? Well, in order to demonstrate that the argument for God is still good, we've got to show what's wrong with the Pinky example. Well, there is something wrong with it. Because it does not seem possible for a material thing to be necessary. Material things do not have to exist. Remember the Leibnizian cosmological argument. We talked about that shiny, translucent, mysterious, spherical ball thing, whatever it was, that we just found in the forest while we were hiking, right? And we came to the conclusion that it's contingent on something and it can't exist necessarily. It's a contingent type of thing. It demands an explanation. So, also, think about this. Material things can be destroyed. And if something can be destroyed, then it no longer exists. And if it no longer exists, then it's not necessary. There's a possible world in which it, whatever you're talking about, does not exist. Material things can be destroyed. And let's keep the Kalam in mind now. When we studied the Kalam cosmological argument, we looked at all the scientific data that demonstrated that the universe, space-time, and all nature began to exist. Well, now we can offer an argument against any material thing that someone claims is necessary. For example, 1. Matter requires space. 2. Space began to exist. 3. Therefore, space is not necessary. There is a possible world in which space does not exist. 4. Therefore, matter is not necessary. 5. Pink unicorns are material things. That is to say, pink unicorns are made of matter. Final conclusion. 6. Therefore, a pink unicorn cannot be necessary. So, we can logically demonstrate that the idea, the concept of a necessary pink unicorn is on the same fallacious level as a married bachelor. So that's not a good example. And plus, we already believe that other realities are at least possible where unicorns do not exist. I bet most of us believe that unicorns don't exist in the actual world. Therefore, it can't be necessary. For example, it really seems possible that there is a reality where only stars exist in the universe, especially after we looked at the fine-tuning argument, and we looked at how if the initial conditions of the Big Bang would have been slightly different, we would have had a radically different universe here. So there could be a universe where there's only stars existing, or where there's no matter at all in the universe, or where there's no animals or no other animals. So there just can't be such a thing as a necessary unicorn. They are impossible, just like triangles with 4 corners. All right, well, let's look at another example. What if someone says, okay, well, what if Pinky were a necessary immaterial pink unicorn, who is also all-powerful and all-knowing and possesses all the Omni attributes? Uh-oh. Well, now we're stuck, huh? Well, you see, an immaterial unicorn isn't really a unicorn anymore, because unicorns have to be material in order to be considered a unicorn. So it seems nonsensical, and therefore it would be impossible to have an immaterial unicorn. You see, what you're doing, if you're going to say, yeah, we've got a pink unicorn who is necessary and immaterial, who's all-powerful and possesses all the Omni attributes, a rose by any other name smells just as sweet. What you're doing is just calling God a pink unicorn. What you're calling a unicorn is really God. A rose by any other name, as Shakespeare said, smells just as sweet. Well, because the more you describe this unicorn to be like something else, the less it really seems like a unicorn. But hey, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and looks like a duck, then it probably is a duck and not a bicycle or anything else. And hey, if it's immaterial and necessary and possesses all the Omni attributes, it's God. It's probably God anyway. Well, so can we use the ontological argument to prove just about any weird thing exists, like necessary, material, immaterial unicorns? No, that does not work. But we can use it to prove that God exists, because the idea of God makes good sense. It's a coherent concept. We can imagine it. We can conceive of it. Now, because God is an immaterial, necessary spirit, the idea of an immaterial spirit is not nonsensical, but the idea of an immaterial, material thing is. That makes no sense. And anyway, like I said, there are other reasons, many reasons, to think that God, to at least think it's possible that God exists. Even if you're not persuaded by one argument, or even if you don't like all of them, all those other, the cumulative case of arguments for the existence of God, they at least show that it's possible that God exists. Now, I'll just note that arguments like the Leibnizian argument and the moral argument, they demonstrate, they conclude a necessary being exists. So with the moral argument that there's no possible world in which torturing toddlers for fun is loving or the right thing to do. There's no well, if that's the case, if there's no possible world, then God exists necessarily and in all possible worlds then. Leibniz does the same thing, and I think even a version of the kalam will show the same thing. But some will say, is the ontological argument still too easy? Well, let's say in a possible reality, there's another God, a God with a little g, named Gaga. Not to be confused with Lady Gaga. But let's say in a possible reality, there's this God with a little g called Gaga. Now, Gaga is an immaterial and necessary spirit who is also all-powerful, all-knowing. But Gaga is not omnibenevolent. He's not all good and loving. He's sometimes good and sometimes bad. Sometimes loving, sometimes hateful. So, Gaga is not omnibenevolent. So, this means that Gaga is sort of like God, possesses all the other properties, but is not maximally great when it comes to benevolence. So Gaga is not as perfect or as great as God. Well, is there anything about Gaga himself that's obviously nonsensical? Anything like a square circle or a married bachelor when it comes to Gaga? No. The idea is coherent. The idea, at least at face value, there's no contradiction here. So, why should only God not be nonsensical? Why can't there be other gods, at least with little g, gods or spirits? So, if that's the case, does the ontological argument show that Gaga exists just as God exists? And so can we use the argument to prove all sorts of little gods exist in our reality? Well, this seems ridiculous as well. This seems absurd. So what's the answer? Well, when you think about it, there can only be one. There can only be one maximally great being. There can only be one all-powerful, necessary God. Why? Because if something is all-powerful, then it can create or destroy anything else if it wants. All you got to do is ask yourself the question, what if God and Gaga got in a fight? Who's going to win? Well, whoever wins is more maximally great than the other, and if neither can win, then neither are maximally great. So if God really were all-powerful, he would have the power to make Gaga not exist. So God can make Gaga not exist if God is all-powerful. So it's possible that Gaga does not exist, because if God is all-powerful, at least in a possible world, God can stop Gaga from existing. So that's to say there's a possible world where Gaga does not exist, where God destroys or does not create Gaga, but that means that Gaga cannot be a necessary being after all. So at face value it seemed coherent. But all you got to do is dig just a little bit and you realize, whoa, wait a second. The concept of Gaga being necessary, if it's possible that God exists, can't be true. So either, A, you believe God is possible, which means Gaga cannot be necessary, which means that there cannot be such a thing as Gaga at all, at least if Gaga means necessary. Or B, you believe that Gaga is possible, which means that God cannot be necessary. So should we believe God is possible or that Gaga is possible? Because it cannot be both if you're going to be logically consistent. It cannot be both if Gaga is a necessary being who is not maximally great. Now there's a few reasons why it's better to think that God is possible but not Gaga. First of all, we got the idea of Gaga from God. We stole from God, as Frank Turek says. We got the idea of God, or we got the idea of Gaga from, or by taking away some of the things from God that make him great. In this case, God's omnibenevolence, him being perfectly good and all-loving. So, if you believe that Gaga is possible, you should also believe that God is possible. But if God is possible, then it turns out that there cannot be such a thing as Gaga. So the concept of Gaga turns out to be impossible. Second, that's the first reason we should think God exists as opposed to Gaga. The second reason is this. The idea of God is simpler than the idea of Gaga. For example, you look at the board here. Imagine something that's 0% great and something that's 100% great. So we start at 0. Is there anything that's going to stop me from getting to 100% here? Is there anything in between here? I don't see anything. So if you just start drawing a line, I can ultimately get to 100%. Nothing stopped me. It's simpler to draw a line all the way to the end than to stop somewhere in between for no good reason at all. So let's say I start here at 0 and I start going down and I'm like, okay, well, nothing's stopping me, but then I see that 100% down there. And I realize this means God. And nothing's stopping me from getting there, but I don't want God to exist. So I'm just going to stop right here. Say, well, it's 50% great, because I don't want God to exist. Hey, that's ad hoc. There's no reason to stop. Or it's even worse. You're guilty of committing the taxicab fallacy. That's where you get in the taxicab and you take it, and then you realize where it's going, and you jump out because you don't like the destination. That's a fallacy. There's nothing stopping you from getting from 0 to 100%. It's simpler to go all the way to the end, than to stop somewhere in between for no good reason at all. Why do you want to stop somewhere in between when you could have gone all the way? Again, remember, not wanting God to exist is not a good reason to jump out of that taxi cab. At least you can give a reason why you stopped at 100%. Because you can't go any further. In the same way, it's simpler to believe that a maximally great, perfectly great God is possible, a maximally great being, rather than a near perfect being, or a near perfectly great God with a little g. Well, if we can choose between something that is great and something that is not as great, and it costs the same, it costs the same amount of money, aren't you going to choose the thing that is greater if it costs the same? I mean, hey, ice cream cones are great, right? Who doesn't like a good ice cream cone? That's a great thing. But if an ice cream cone costs the same as a new car, pick your favorite model. Aren't you going to pick the car? Hey, if they cost the same and I can only have one, I'm taking the car. So we have better reason to think God is possible and not Gaga. So the ontological argument cannot be used to prove all sorts of gods exist. Only one. There can be only one maximally great being by definition. There can only be one God with a capital G. If it's even possible for God to exist, he does exist. God is so great. A philosopher from Birmingham named Eugen Nagasawa. Last I knew, I could be wrong about this, but I believe that Professor Nagasawa is not a Christian, and I think maybe even agnostic. I could be wrong on that, but he's a philosopher at Birmingham in England who studies perfect being theology. And he just came out with a book. I'm buying the book today, and I can't wait to read it. But I saw one of his quotes online, and let me read this to you. He says this: "Yet the modal ontological argument is important because it seems to reduce the burden of proof on theists dramatically. They no longer need to rely on traditional arguments for the actuality of the existence of God, which appeal to the origin of the universe, the source of morality, the apparent design in the universe, testimonies of miracles, and so on. All they need to do is show that the existence of God is at least possible. And if we can show that, we can simply plug it into the modal ontological argument and derive, as a matter of logic, that the existence of God is actual. Hence, the modal ontological argument places us only a half step away from a definitive proof of the existence of God. Only a half step away. I suppose that other half step is where faith might come in. You know, I've given the entire ontological argument without touching a Bible today. And as I normally do in these talks, I don't want to start with the Bible. I want to make our conclusions and then see if it lines up with what the Bible says. To confirm, maybe, what the Bible says. To give us reasons to trust the Bible. But let's look at what God said to Moses in Exodus 3:14. I am who I am. I think God is saying, I am ultimate reality. All things in all worlds are contingent upon me. Therefore, there is no reality, no world that could possibly exist apart from me. And I think that John was trying to convey the same message in John 8:58. I think that John was conveying that Jesus taught and believed that he was ultimate reality when John writes, before Abraham was, I am. Think about that. I am ultimate reality. Have a good day.